The knife was already at Genevieve Castell's throat before Aurelian Sangrave moved, not walked, not ran, moved, a blur of white hair and ancient fury that crossed 30 feet of marble corridor in less time than it took her heart to complete a single terrified beat. His hand closed around the wrist of the vampire holding her, and the sound that followed was not a crack so much as a statement of absolute finality. The attacker dropped. The knife clattered against the polished floor of the Sangrave estate's lower hall, and the ringing echo of it seemed to last far longer than it should have. Genevieve exhaled. She had not realized she was holding her breath until the cold edge of the blade was no longer kissing her skin. Aurelian did not look at her yet. He was looking down at the vampire on the floor, a courier from the Ruthless court, as it turned out, which meant this was not random. This was a message. His pale face was composed, impossibly composed, but she had spent 8 months in proximity to him, and she had learned to read the tension in the set of his jaw the way other people read weather patterns. He was furious. He was frightened, and Aurelian Sangrave did not do frightened. "Get up," he said to the courier, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that preceded thunder. "Tell Lord Ruthless that the next envoy he sends into my house with a blade meant for my physician will not be returned at all. Tell him I said it exactly that way." The courier scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist, and fled through the side passage without another word. The heavy door boomed shut behind him, and then Aurelian turned to her. His eyes were the color of old amber, burnished and deep, and, at this particular moment, they were doing something she had only seen once before. The night he had found her unconscious in the East Wing after a different kind of ambush, a night neither of them had properly spoken about since. They were doing the thing where they softened just barely, just enough. Genevieve, her name in his mouth, always sounded like something that had been carved rather than spoken, deliberate, precise, irreversible. "Are you injured?" She touched her own throat. There was no blood. There would be a bruise, probably the kind she would catalogue clinically and note without sentiment, the way she catalogued everything. "No," she said, "I'm not injured." He crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 steps and lifted her chin with 2 fingers, not roughly, never roughly, but with that absolute authority he seemed incapable of abandoning, and examined her neck himself, as if her word alone were insufficient, as if he needed to confirm it with his own eyes before his body would believe it. She let him. She had stopped arguing with his protective impulses approximately 4 months ago, when she had realized that arguing with them caused him more distress than simply allowing them. "Aurelian," she said quietly. "Do not tell me it was nothing," he said, and the amber in his eyes had gone darker. "I can tell by your pulse that you are frightened." "I was frightened," she corrected. "Past tense, you arrived." Something shifted in his face, something she did not have clinical language for, which was itself notable, because Genevieve Castell had clinical language for almost everything. She was 31 years old, a hematologist and immunologist with 2 doctorates, and she had spent the last 8 months living inside the most secret, most guarded, most politically dangerous vampire estate in the country. She had arrived with a medical contract, a rolling suitcase, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. She understood considerably more now. She understood, for instance, that Aurelian Sangrave had been assigned. Programmed was perhaps not too strong a word, given how deeply it had been wired into his very identity, to protect. He was the last remaining pure-blooded heir of the Sangrave line, one of the oldest vampire families in existence, and his entire 300-year existence had been structured around the concept of guardianship. He had protected courts, he had protected alliances, he had protected secrets and treaties and bloodlines and ancient vows that most of the human world did not know existed. He had never, in all that time, allowed anyone to protect him. The very concept seemed to cause him something close to physical discomfort. Genevieve had a theory about this, the way she had theories about most things. She was working on testing it. She was not expecting the testing to escalate quite this quickly. The Velthris message changed everything. She had known, in the abstract, that there were factions within the vampire world who resented her presence here. Her contract with the Sangrave estate was unusual. Aurelian had brought her in not as a blood supplier or a court ornament, the roles that most humans played when they were permitted inside vampire society, but as a physician, a researcher. He had a condition, a blood condition, technically, which was a thing that most vampires and most humans would consider an impossible contradiction. But Genevieve had been specifically recommended to him because she had published, under a carefully anonymized identity, 3 papers on anomalous hemolytic processes in post-mortem circulatory systems. Someone in the vampire world had been reading academic journals. She still found that slightly astonishing. The condition was real and it was serious, and in the 8 months she had been here, she had made significant progress on it. But the Velthris court did not want progress. The Velthris court wanted Aurelian Sangrave weakened, because a weakened Sangrave was a Sangrave who could not hold the Northern Alliance together, and a fractured Northern Alliance meant the Velthris family could expand their territory across 4 contested districts and 2 blood law treaties that currently stood between them and considerable power. The knife at her throat had not been random at all. It had been a calculation. "They know what you're doing for me," Aurelian said. He had not released her chin. He seemed to realize this only a moment after she did, and his hand dropped with a controlled deliberateness that she recognized as him refusing to be embarrassed by it. "They know your research is working, then," Genevieve said. He stared at her. "You were just held at knife point. I'm aware. I was there." She pulled her white coat slightly straighter. She wore it even here, even in the Gothic corridors of an estate that had existed for 2 centuries beneath the streets of a city that knew nothing about it, because it was armor of a different kind. "Aurelian, if Velthris is escalating, that means we're close to something that actually threatens him. That's information. That's useful." He turned away from her, moved to the tall window at the end of the corridor, and stood looking out at the underground garden. One of the estate's stranger features, a greenhouse cavern 3 floors below street level, lit by carefully calibrated artificial sunlight that vampires could tolerate at certain wavelengths. She watched the line of his shoulders, white coat, white shirt beneath it, white hair swept back with that elegant carelessness that she had eventually determined was not careless at all. Everything about Aurelian was deliberate. He simply made deliberate look effortless. "I brought you here to help me," he said, "not to endanger you. You brought me here to research a blood anomaly that, if left untreated, will eventually compromise your immune response to the point where you cannot survive even minor cellular damage. You brought me here because the condition is progressive, and you had, by your own estimate, perhaps another 30 years before it became critical." She moved to stand beside him, not in front of him, because she had learned that standing in front of him when he was in this particular mood felt too much like confrontation and not enough like alliance. You brought me here because you were desperate, even if you would never use that word. The silence stretched. I do not get desperate, he said. You got me, she said, which amounts to the same thing. The ghost of something crossed his mouth, not quite a smile. He had a whole vocabulary of almost expressions that she had been cataloguing for months. Velthris will not stop at one messenger, he said finally. He will send more. He will find other ways to apply pressure. He turned to look at her directly, and the full weight of that amber gaze was something she had never quite gotten used to, no matter how much she told herself she had. I need you to understand the seriousness of your position here. Genevieve, I understand it perfectly. You understand it intellectually. That is not the same thing. She met his gaze steadily. Then, tell me the difference. Another silence, longer and more complicated than the first. Outside the window, the artificial garden shimmered gently in its engineered light. The difference, he said quietly, is that understanding it intellectually allows you to treat it as a problem to be solved. Understanding it truly means acknowledging that you could die here, that I could. He stopped. His jaw tightened, that my failure to protect you adequately could cost you everything. She understood then what he was actually saying, not the surface words, the thing underneath them. Aurelian, she said his name the same way he said hers, deliberately. I am not leaving. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I know. And that, she would think later, was probably the moment. Things shifted, not the knife, not the danger, not even the months of proximity and quiet understanding that had been building between them like pressure in a sealed chamber. It was that simple acknowledgement, I know. And everything, it admitted. She had not been brought here to be protected. But she was not leaving, and he knew it. And so somewhere in the architecture of his 300-year-old certainty about how protection worked, a door had opened. 3 days after the Velthris courier, Genevieve was back in the laboratory. The laboratory was her domain in a way that no other part of the estate was, and she had made it so deliberately. She had rearranged the equipment within the first week, had ordered additional centrifuge components through channels Aurelian had made available to her, had covered one entire wall with a whiteboard dense with notation that she suspected none of the vampire staff could fully read. It smelled of antiseptic and distilled compounds and the particular neutral clarity of a space dedicated to answers. Aurelian was seated in the single chair she'd placed beside the central examination table, not on the table itself, because getting him onto the table had proven to be a prolonged negotiation that she was still in the middle of, watching her work with the particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize as his default mode for everything. Total, unblinking. The kind of attention that would have been uncomfortable coming from anyone else, but that she had somehow, gradually, come to find settling. The anomaly is accelerating, she said, not looking up from the slide she was preparing. Your last sample showed a 14% increase in the degradation pattern over the previous month. You told me that yesterday. I'm telling you again, because I want you to understand why what I'm about to propose is necessary and not optional. She heard him shift in the chair. A slight thing. For most people it would be nothing. For Aurelian, it was the equivalent of a full-body flinch. Go ahead, he said. She set down the slide carefully and turned to face him. I need a continuous monitoring implant, a small subcutaneous device here. She touched the inside of her own wrist to indicate the location. That will give me real-time data on the cellular degradation pattern. rather than the snapshots I'm getting from periodic samples. The anomaly is behaving irregularly. I'm missing the peaks. I need the full picture to understand what's triggering the acceleration, and I can't get the full picture without continuous data. He looked at the point on her wrist where she had touched. Then he looked at her face. You're describing a medical implant. That's correct. On me, that's also correct. The silence had weight to it. She watched him work through whatever internal process this triggered and waited, because she had learned that rushing his processing of medical interventions was counterproductive. It's a minor procedure, she said, when the silence had gone on long enough. Local anesthetic, a 3mm incision. The device is smaller than your thumbnail. I've done it dozens of times on human patients. The physiology is slightly different with vampires, but I have adapted the technique and... It's not the procedure, he said. She paused. What is it? He was looking at his own hands now, resting on his knees with that contained, deliberate stillness. I have not been under medical care in 140 years, he said. The last physician who treated me was a vampire court surgeon named Vostorak, who performed the equivalent of medieval bloodletting while reciting ancient vows, and charged my family an obscene amount of blood currency for the privilege. A beat. He also misdiagnosed a spinal fracture as spiritual imbalance. Genevieve blinked. That's genuinely appalling. It was somewhat unpleasant, yes. His tone was dry. Medical intervention, in my experience, has not been synonymous with care. She understood what he was not saying. He had been brought up in a tradition, in an identity, where vulnerability was managed through control, where admitting to a wound meant admitting to a weakness, where the entire concept of allowing another person to help you physically was coded as dangerous. Not because it was inherently dangerous, because for 300 years it had been made dangerous, because he existed in a world where showing the extent of your compromised condition was information that could be weaponized, and information weaponized against Aurelian Sangrave had the potential to destabilize alliances, shatter blood law treaties, and invite exactly the kind of attack the Velthris courier had just previewed. I'm not Vostorak, she said. I'm aware, and I'm not going to tell anyone what I find. I know that too. He looked up. It is not about trust, Genevieve. I trust you. That is perhaps the most alarming thing that has happened to me in decades. Something warm moved through her chest. She kept her face, professional. Then let me help you. Another long silence. Then he extended his arm toward her, palm up, in a gesture that was so simply, quietly yielding that it took her a moment to process it as the enormously significant thing it actually was. Aurelian Sangrave, 300 years old, pure-blooded heir of an ancient line, the man who had held the Northern Alliance together through sheer force of presence and will, extending his arm and turning his palm up like a patient in a doctor's office. She crossed to him immediately, before he could reconsider, and began preparing the site with the calm, precise hands that were her greatest professional asset. She could feel the temperature difference of his skin, cooler than a human's always, not unpleasantly so, with a kind of smooth solidity that human skin did not quite have, and she could feel the slight tension in his forearm that told her this was costing him more than he was showing. Tell me something, she said, because she had found that talking helped, that it gave him something to anchor to during the procedure that was not the procedure itself. What would you like me to tell you? Tell me about the Northern Alliance, how it started. I know the basic political structure, but not the history. A beat. Then, slowly, the tension in his forearm lessened slightly as he began to speak. He talked about alliances formed in the early 19th century, about blood law treaties hammered out in underground chambers while wars raged overhead, about the way vampire courts had learned, painfully, over generations, that fragmentation was annihilation. His voice was even and low, and carried the particular texture of someone who had lived through the events they were describing, rather than read about them. And Genevieve worked steadily, and listened, and felt the strange, specific intimacy of this moment, him trusting her with his vulnerability, her trusting him with her presence in his world, the two of them in this bright antiseptic room that was the most honest space in the entire vast estate. The implant was in and sealed within 6 minutes. She dressed the site neatly and stepped back. "Done," she said. He looked at his wrist, then at her. The expression on his face was something she had not seen before. Not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly, but something that encompassed both of those and went further, into territory she did not have a clean label for. "That's it," he said. "That's it." She smiled. And it was a real smile, the kind she did not always manage to produce in professional contexts. "Welcome to modern medicine." Something happened in his face when she smiled. She had noticed this before, but had been filing it carefully under observations requiring more data. Now, with the implant secured and the data already beginning to transmit to her tablet, she found it harder to maintain the professional distance that the filing system required. He said, "Yes, thank you." 2 words. She had the distinct impression they did not come easily to him. Not because he lacked gratitude. She had come to understand that Aurelian Sangrave was, at his core, deeply honoring of things that deserved to be honored, but because accepting help and then thanking someone for it was its own kind of vulnerability, and every act of vulnerability was, for him, a conscious choice rather than a natural motion. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised even her. The data started coming in overnight, and by the following morning, Genevieve had what she had suspected but not been able to confirm. The degradation was not random. It followed a pattern tied to emotional and physiological stress responses, specifically the kind of sustained, high-level stress that came from constant guardianship, from the perpetual state of monitoring and protecting and managing threat. The anomaly was not primarily a blood condition. It was, at its root, a stress response condition that had been compounding for long enough that it had become a blood condition. 3 centuries of never resting, never being off duty, never allowing himself to be protected, had created a cellular feedback loop that was slowly, systematically destroying him. She sat with this for a long time before she told him. When she did tell him, she did it in the laboratory, with the data visible on the large monitor, so that she could show rather than simply tell, because she had learned that he responded better to evidence than to conclusions. He listened without interrupting, which he always did, and watched the data she was walking him through with that total attention, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that the cause of the condition is the condition of my life." Essentially, yes. She kept her voice clinical, because this was the kind of information that needed to be delivered calmly. "The physiological pattern is clear. Your system has been running at maximum protective capacity for so long that it has begun cannibalizing itself. The cellular anomaly is the biological expression of 300 years of never allowing anyone to guard your back." He stood very still. "That is not a medical diagnosis. That is a philosophical indictment. It's both. She met his eyes. The treatment protocol I'm developing targets the cellular mechanism, but the cellular mechanism will keep regenerating unless the underlying cause is addressed, which means, Aurelian, that you have to let people in. Not metaphorically, actually, structurally. You have to stop being the only protection in the room. The silence that followed was the longest and most complex of all the silences she had sat through with him. I do not know how to do that, he said finally, and the honesty of it, the stripped, unguarded quality of it, hit her somewhere below the sternum. I know, she said. That's why we're going to practice. He looked at her. Practice. Starting with this. You are going to stay in this building this afternoon while I go with Thessaly to retrieve the additional lab components we ordered from the surface supplier. You are not going to come with us. You are going to let the estate security do its job without supplementing it with your personal presence, and you are going to stay here and let someone else handle a minor errand without your oversight. Thessaly was one of his senior guards, ancient by human standards, young by vampire ones, white-haired like all pure vampires, and competent beyond question. Aurelian had selected her himself, Thessaly as adequate for the task, he said. I know she is, so stay here. His jaw was doing the thing again. If anything happens to you, then Thessaly will handle it. And if she cannot handle it, I will call you and you will arrive in approximately 90 seconds regardless of where you are on this estate. She tilted her head. You know I'm right. I know you're right, he said, with the slight, exasperated quality of someone who finds being correct somewhat irritating when applied to himself. I also know that knowing you are right and enacting what you are right about are two entirely different categories of experience. Welcome to what it's like to be human, she said. We live there all the time, he laughed. It was short, surprised, barely there, but it was a real laugh, and she had only heard it twice before, and both times it had done something to the quality of the air in the room, made it feel lighter and stranger and more alive. He pressed his mouth together immediately, as if recalling that laughing was not something he did, but the remnant of it was still in his eyes. Go, he said. Take Thessaly. Come back. I will, she said. She went. She came back. The supply run was entirely uneventful, which was itself a kind of evidence. He was standing in the main hall when she returned, not pacing. He would never pace. It was too undignified, but standing with the very specific quality of someone who had been standing in one place for some time and was pretending they had not. She did not say anything about this. She simply set the supply case on the hall table and said, All good. Thessaly is excellent, incidentally. You trained her well. Something eased in him. Yes, he said. She is. It was a beginning. Small and imperfect and slightly strained, but a beginning. The real crisis came 3 weeks later. She had been expecting something from Velthris. The courier incident was too calculated to be a single move. But the form it took was not what she had anticipated. It was not another physical attack. It was worse. It was a legal move, a formal petition to the ancient council, the governing body of vampire courts across the continent, claiming that the Sangrave estate was harboring an unsanctioned human researcher who was, according to the petition, conducting experiments that violated blood law. The petition was largely fabricated. But the ancient council was not a body that dismissed petitions from a court as old and politically connected as Velthris, regardless of their accuracy. Aurelian called a meeting in the estate's council chamber, a room Genevieve had never been inside before, high-ceilinged and dark-panelled, lit by long iron candelabras. with a table long enough to seat 20 that currently seated 7. His senior advisors, all vampires, all ancient-looking in that timeless way that Genevieve was still not entirely accustomed to, and her. She was the only human at the table. She was also, as it turned out, the primary subject of the meeting. "The petition names Dr. Castell specifically," said Mordecai Vane. "Aurelian's chief legal counsel, a vampire with a grey-streaked white braid, and the focused expression of someone who had argued cases before courts that did not officially exist. It alleges unsanctioned blood research, which under the Fourth Blood Compact means research conducted without authorization from a recognized vampire authority." "I have authorization," Aurelian said. His voice was flat and cold. "From me. I am a recognized vampire authority. You are, but you are also the subject of the research, which creates a conflict of interest argument under the Compact's 3rd clause. Velthrus's legal team has been thorough." Mordecai's expression communicated extreme displeasure at having to admit this. "They have also added a secondary claim that Dr. Castell's presence represents a security risk to blood law information under Article 9. Article 9 governs the disclosure of vampire vulnerability data to human parties," said another advisor, Calixta, one of Aurelian's oldest allies, who had the sharp-planed face of a woman, carved from marble, and the politics of someone who had survived 6 regime changes. "If they can demonstrate that she has access to clinically sensitive information about vampire biology, she is my physician," Aurelian said. "Of course she has access to clinically sensitive information about vampire biology. That is the entire point. Under Article 9, that access is permitted only if the human party has taken the blood oath of silence," Calixta said, "which Dr. Castell has not." Genevieve had been listening to this with growing clarity. "What is the blood oath of silence?" she asked. The table went slightly quiet. She had noticed that her direct questions sometimes produced this effect, as if the vampires in the room had half forgotten. She was going to participate in the conversation. Mordecai answered carefully. "It is a ritual oath, binding the oath-taker to silence on all matters pertaining to vampire vulnerability. It is sealed with blood, a single drop from the oath-taker and a drop from the binding authority, and it carries both legal and, in some accounts, metaphysical enforcement." Metaphysical enforcement meaning what? Meaning that violation of the oath is, historically, associated with consequences that extend beyond the purely legal. He paused. "The evidence for the metaphysical component is largely anecdotal." "Largely," said Calixta, with the tone of someone who has personally observed the non-largely portion. Genevieve looked at Aurelian. He was looking at with an expression she could read clearly by now. Alert, assessing, and deeply, specifically opposed to the direction this conversation was heading. "There is an additional complication," Mordecai said. "The Ancient Council has appointed a witness to attend the estate during the investigation period. Standard procedure. The witness will be here within 48 hours. "Who?" Aurelian asked. Mordecai's pause was fractionally too long. "Lord Draventus." The temperature in the room, already not particularly warm, seemed to drop further. Aurelian was still, but the kind of still that preceded movement. "Explain to me," Genevieve said quietly, "why that name produces this particular reaction." Calixta answered, because Aurelian did not appear to be speaking. "Lord Draventus is the Ancient Council's most senior witness. He is also, historically, aligned with the Velthrus interest. He was present for the last 3 investigations brought by Velthrus. All 3 resulted in sanctions. He is not corrupt," Aurelian said finally. "He is simply persuadable." by arguments sufficiently dressed in precedent. His jaw was hard, and Velthris has always known how to dress an argument. "What are our options?" Genevieve asked. "Option 1, Mordecai said. We comply fully with the investigation, demonstrate that all research is authorized and non-violating, and hope that Draventis is not sufficiently persuaded by Velthris's framing. Probability of success, approximately 40%, given Draventis's history. Option 2, Dr. Castell takes the blood oath of silence, which resolves the Article 9 violation and removes the secondary claim. This significantly strengthens our position, probability of success with the oath, approximately 75%. Genevieve looked at the table for a moment, then she looked at Aurelian. "Then I take the oath no," he said immediately. "Aurelian, the metaphysical component is not anecdotal." His voice allowed no argument. "I have seen the oath enforced. It is not a comfortable experience, and the binding is permanent. I will not place you under a permanent magical constraint to solve a political problem of my world." "It's my choice," she said. "Not this one." His eyes were amber fire. "Not this." She held his gaze, and she understood. Again, something she had been understanding in increments for months. That his protectiveness was not about controlling her. It was about the specific, consuming terror of watching harm approach someone She completed the thought before she meant to, and then sat with it quietly. Someone he loved, and being unable to stop it. The programming ran that deep. His entire self was organized around preventing damage to those he claimed. And she had become, somewhere in the past 8 months, someone he claimed. "Then we go with option 1, she said, "and we make the 40% look like certainty." 3 days of preparation followed, and then Lord Draventis arrived. He was older than Aurelian by the look of him, more white, if that was possible, with the kind of deep-lined face that suggested centuries rather than decades, and eyes the color of cold silver. He moved through the estate with the unhurried authority of someone who had conducted a great many investigations and expected them all to end the same way. Genevieve met him in the main reception room, with Aurelian at her side and Mordecai at her other side, and she gave Lord Draventis the same direct, clear-eyed regard she gave everyone who underestimated her, which was most people. "Dr. Castell," he said, after looking at her for a moment, in the particular way that vampires sometimes did, assessing, cataloguing. "You are younger than I expected. I find that most people say that about me," she said pleasantly. Something flickered in his silver eyes. Recalculation. She had found that recalibrating people's initial assessments early was generally productive. The investigation proceeded over 4 days. Mordecai was brilliant. He had prepared documentation that was architecturally impeccable, anticipating every angle of the Velthris argument and countering it with precedent stacked on precedent. Genevieve presented her research methodology with the same precision she brought to academic peer review, and she answered every question Draventis put to her with the clear, direct language of someone who was not hiding anything because there was nothing to hide. But on the 3rd day, something happened that changed the shape of everything. Draventis asked to examine the research data directly, all of it, including the implant monitoring data. This was within his investigative rights, and Mordecai could not block it without raising further suspicion. Genevieve handed over the data access. Draventis reviewed it for 2 hours in the estate's private study. When he emerged, he came directly to the laboratory, where Genevieve was working, and Aurelian was positioned precisely in the chair beside the central table, exactly as he always was. which was a position he had apparently been occupying often enough that Dreventis noticed it. This condition, Dreventis said, looking at the data display with an expression that had, very slightly, shifted from investigative neutrality towards something else. The progressive cellular anomaly. Yes, Genevieve said. I have seen this before. His voice was quiet, careful in a different way than it had been careful. Not in Sangrave, in another line, longer ago than you would find useful. He paused. The physician who attempted to treat it at that time did not have your methodology. The patient did not survive. The room was very still. Who was the patient? Aurelian asked. Someone whose name is not relevant to this investigation. But Dreventis's silver eyes moved to Aurelian with an expression that was, unmistakably, complicated. What is relevant is that the treatment approach documented in this data is materially different from anything attempted before, and that the progression has slowed by 22% since the monitoring implant was placed. 26%, Genevieve said. That's the latest figure. 3 days ago, it was 22. Dreventis looked at her. Something in his face had changed, and it was not small. Dr. Castell, he said after a moment, you will understand if I ask an indelicate question. Go ahead. Are you aware of the political context of this investigation? Comprehensively, and you remain here, regardless. Comprehensively, she said again, with exactly the same intonation. Dreventis was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He looked at Aurelian directly, with the full weight of his silver gaze, and said, You are not protecting this woman in the way you usually protect those in your care, are you? It was not quite a question. Aurelian said nothing, but his hands had stilled on his knees in a way that was itself an answer. No, Genevieve said calmly. We're working on it, going both ways. Dreventis almost smiled. It was a very old expression on a very old face, and it carried something that looked a great deal like recognition. He submitted his report to the ancient council the following morning. His findings stated that the research being conducted at the Sangrave estate was fully authorized, medically necessary, and not in violation of any blood law. The secondary claim under Article 9 was dismissed on the grounds that the research pertained to a specific individual's private medical condition rather than general vampire vulnerability information, and that precedent supported this distinction in 14 documented prior cases. The council accepted the report within hours. The Velthris petition was denied. Mordecai, when he relayed this news, was barely containing his surprise. Dreventis has never ruled against Velthris, he said, in 60 years of witness appointments. People change their minds, Genevieve said, when they're given genuinely new information. Aurelian looked at her for a long moment. You knew, he said. I hoped, she corrected. There's a difference. That night, after the estate had settled into its quieter rhythms, and the advisors had dispersed, and the immediate threat had for the moment receded, Aurelian came to the laboratory. This was not unusual. He came most evenings, had been coming most evenings for months. But something about this arrival was different in a way she registered immediately. He did not take the chair. He stood, instead, by the window looking into the underground garden, and there was a quality to his stillness that was not composed so much as it was deliberate in the way that preceded something being said. Sit down, she said, because she was updating the monitoring data, and she could conduct this conversation and work at the same time, and because telling him to sit was one of the small, ordinary acts of reversal that the treatment protocol called for, he sat in the chair without negotiation. She made a note of this, both in the clinical record and in the internal record she did not write down. The Velthris situation will not end here, he said. The petition was a first move. There will be others, I know, and Dreventis's ruling, while significant, does not change the underlying political dynamic. Velthris still wants the Northern Alliance fragmented. I still have a progressive condition that gives him leverage if he can fix it widely enough. I know that too, so you understand, he said. Staying here continues to be dangerous. Aurelian. She set down her stylus and looked at him directly. If you are, in a very roundabout way, trying to tell me to leave for my own safety, I need you to understand that I was told that last week and the week before, and my answer has not changed. I'm not telling you to leave. He met her eyes. I am telling you that I am aware of what you risk by staying, and that I am aware of what it means that you choose to stay regardless, and that He stopped. The amber in his eyes had gone deep. I find that I am struggling with what to do with that. She waited. I have protected people for 300 years, he said slowly, as if discovering the sentence as he spoke it. Courts, alliances, bloodlines, treaties. I have not, the concept of someone choosing to remain in danger because of me, specifically, rather than because of an obligation or a contract. He stopped again. You did not have to stay. Your contract has been technically fulfillable in a remote format. You know this. Yes, she said, and you stayed anyway. Yes, because of the research, he said. But the way he said it made it a question rather than a statement. She was quiet for a moment, organizing what she wanted to say with the same care she organized everything. Then, partly because of the research matters enormously to me. You're my patient, and the work is important, and I am not the kind of physician who abandons a case midway through. She paused. And partly because of somewhere in the past 8 months, I have become significantly invested in you. As a person, not only as a patient. The silence after this was different from all the other silences. It had a particular quality, warm and taut and very careful, like something that could be broken if handled wrongly. Genevieve, her name, the way he said it. Carved, irreversible. I need to be clear with you about something. Go ahead. I am 300 years old. I am ancient by any measure, and my world is brutal, and my political situation is, at present, unstable in ways that will not resolve quickly. I have nothing to offer you that is simple or safe or easy, he paused. And I am aware, acutely aware, that I have been building walls between the thing I feel and the expression of that thing, because I have convinced myself that the walls were protective. For you. Walls for my benefit, she said, built entirely by you, without my input. A very slight pause. Yes, that, she said, is a textbook example of the underlying issue we've been treating for weeks. Something moved through him, a breath, almost, though vampires did not breathe from necessity, just from habit. And then, slowly, the set of his face changed, not to something open or unguarded, because Aurelian Sangrave was not built for unguarded in the way that humans sometimes were, but to something honest, to something that was not performing composure because it no longer felt that it needed to. I love you, he said, as simply as that, as directly as that. No preamble, no qualification. No architecture of caution surrounding it, just the sentence, precise and irrevocable. I have loved you for, I am not certain when it began. Perhaps when you rearranged my laboratory without asking permission, and then handed me a detailed justification for every change before I could object. Perhaps before that. He paused. I am not accustomed to loving people. I am not accustomed to what it does to the protective impulse. It becomes something larger and less controllable than guardianship, which is alarming, and I have been managing the alarm by treating the feeling as a security risk." She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, warm and clear, and the sound of it did the same thing to the room that his laugh had done weeks ago, made it lighter. "And strange that," she said, "is the most Aurelian thing you have ever said to me. I am aware it is not conventionally romantic. It is, actually. It's exactly you, and exactly you is." She stood from her stool and crossed to him, and she sat on the edge of the examination table, so they were closer in height, closer in proximity, and she looked at him steadily. "I love you too. I have been conducting a very clinical internal debate about whether to say that for approximately 6 weeks, because the situational complexity is significant, and I am generally cautious, and I was not certain the feeling was fully mutual." "It is fully mutual," he said, with the absolute precision of someone who has checked this multiple times. "I gathered that." He raised one hand and touched her face, not with 2 fingers this time, not the careful diagnostic touch that was about assessment, but with his whole palm, gentle and certain, and the temperature difference of his hand was something she had logged in her clinical notes as a physiological datum, but was experiencing now as nothing clinical at all, as something entirely its own. "You are going to keep treating me," he said, "obviously. And I am going to keep protecting you, within reason," she said. "We're still working on the ratio." "Within reason," he agreed, and then, quietly, with the ghost of that same almost smile, "You have managed to make me negotiate with my own instincts, Genevieve. Do you understand how remarkable that is?" "I have some sense of it, yes." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, the gesture so unexpectedly tender from him that she felt the warmth of it move all the way through her. He was not the kind of man who made small, tender gestures. He was the kind of man who moved at inhuman speed to prevent knives from reaching people he loved, who sat for hours in a laboratory chair, not because he needed to, but because proximity was the only language his protectiveness had been speaking for the last 8 months. He was the kind of man who had been breaking his own programming slowly and deliberately, because someone had shown him that the programming was hurting him and had broken it all the way open by telling her the truth. "I need you to understand something," he murmured, "about what it means for someone like me to be in this position. Tell me. In my world, attachment is a strategic vulnerability. The people you love become targets. You have already been targeted once because of your proximity to me. It will happen again. The protective instinct, what you call programming, it exists, in part, because loving someone and then failing them is," he paused, a very small pause. "It is a thing I have experienced before, long ago, and it is the thing that built every wall I have spent 300 years constructing." She was still. "Tell me about it," she said. "When you're ready. There's no urgency." "There is never urgency with you," he said, and it sounded like relief. "That is one of the things, one of the many things." He pulled back enough to look at her, and the amber of his eyes in this proximity was extraordinarily layered and warm and deeply, specifically alive, in a way that she suspected most people never saw, because most people were never this close, and never in this particular conversation. "You treat my condition as a solvable problem. You treat my political situation as a navigable complexity. You treat my nature, all of it, the age, the blood, the court, the darkness, as something to be understood rather than feared or romanticized." "It's interesting," she said simply. "All of it, you are interesting. The world you live in is interesting. I'm a researcher. Finding things interesting is how I'm built. You find me interesting, he said, with the slightly incredulous quality of someone encountering a perspective that has not previously occurred to them. Deeply, she said. Now kiss me before we both overthink it. He kissed her. It was unlike anything that had a clinical description. It was the accumulated weight of 8 months of proximity and building understanding, and the specific intimacy of her hands on his wrist, and his eyes watching her work, and his voice filling her laboratory with ancient history, and his presence filling the chair beside her table like something that had always been there and now always would be. It was careful and certain and warmer than she had expected, and it tasted faintly of that particular stillness he carried. And when it ended, she was aware that something had changed shape permanently, and that this was exactly as it should be. Good, she said, when she had her equilibrium back. Good, he agreed, with that almost smile that was now a full smile. Small and precise, but whole. She catalogued it. This one she was not filing under observations requiring more data. This one she was keeping. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing in Aurelian Sangrave's world was simple, and the Velthris situation was not resolved by a single council ruling. Lord Velthris himself argued at the Northern Alliance Summit 3 weeks later, a gathering of 7 vampire courts, held in the deep levels of an undisclosed location that Genevieve was brought to for the first time as Aurelian's physician of record. The classification mattered. She was not an observer. She was essential personnel. Velthris was a tall vampire with iron-colored hair, and the kind of smooth, cold courtesy that was more hostile than open aggression. He looked at Genevieve once, briefly, and then did not look at her again, which was its own kind of statement. The summit was 4 days of politics in a language that Genevieve was still partly learning, but she had Mordecai explaining context quietly beside her at certain moments and Aurelian's hand at her back at others, and she followed the architecture of it well enough. The real confrontation came on the 3rd day, when Velthris introduced a new proposal that the Northern Alliance adopt a blanket restriction on human medical access to vampire court members, citing the Article 9 concerns that Draventis had dismissed. Aurelian's response was not the one she had been expecting. She had been expecting the cold, authoritative version of him, the one that shut things down with the force of ancient presence and political weight. Instead, he asked for the floor and stood and explained, with surgical precision, what he had learned in 8 months of medical care. He did not detail his condition. That information remained protected, but he described the principle, the concept of a physician who had extended his functioning capacity and was currently on track to extend his lifespan meaningfully. And he described the stupidity, in practical terms, of the Northern Alliance, rejecting tools that worked because of outdated blood law anxiety. He did not use the word stupid. He used something considerably more diplomatic, but the implication was clear. He also, at the end, said something that made the room very quiet. "I will speak to the matter of trust," he said, and his voice had the particular quality that it got when he was saying something absolutely true. "The physician currently under my care is in this room. She has operated for 8 months, with full access to medically sensitive information. She has been threatened, investigated, and subjected to a process designed to intimidate her into leaving. She has not left. She has not disclosed anything. She has not been used as a lever against me. Not because it wasn't attempted, but because she is not available to be used as a lever, because she is." He paused. The pause was not uncertainty, it was emphasis. Because she is with me, completely and voluntarily, and with full awareness of what that means. The ancient council's own senior witness reviewed her work and found it exemplary. I will not support any sea restriction that would prevent other courts from accessing this quality of care. The vote on Velthriss's proposal was 7-1. Velthriss was the one. In the corridor outside the summit chamber, after, Calixta put her hand briefly on Genevieve's arm, an unexpectedly warm gesture from her, and said, "He has never spoken about a personal attachment in a political oath in 300 years. You understand what that declaration means in our world." "I'm starting to understand," Genevieve said. "It means he has chosen the vulnerability deliberately. He has put it on record." Calixta's marble face carried something that was almost maternal. "In our world, that is the equivalent of a blood oath. It cannot be taken back." Genevieve thought about this. "Good," she said. Calixta almost smiled. The Velthriss situation found its resolution not through further confrontations, but through a development none of them had anticipated. Lord Velthriss's own heir, a young vampire named Sorvain, came quietly to Mordecai with information. Sorvain was 20 years old in vampire terms, young enough to have been raised in a world slightly different from his father's, in a world where the debates about human vampire boundaries were shifting. He had been watching the summit. He had been watching Aurelian's declaration. He had been watching Genevieve's calm, clear-eyed presence in a room full of ancient vampires, and something in him had apparently decided that his father was on the wrong side of a line that mattered. The information Sorvain provided was documentation of Velthriss's most recent manipulation of a blood law treaty, not related to the Sangrave situation, but to an older conflict between two southern courts, one of which had been unjustly sanctioned based on evidence Velthriss had fabricated. The documentation was sufficient to bring a counter-petition before the ancient council that would, at minimum, permanently reduce Velthriss's political standing and, at maximum, result in sanctions that would end his expansion ambitions entirely. "Sorvain is betraying his own father," Aurelian said, when Mordecai brought this to them. There was no judgment in his voice, just the recognition of what it cost. "He is choosing what he thinks is right over what is easy," Genevieve said. "Yes." Aurelian looked at her. "He is." A slight pause. "I will make certain he has protection during the process." "He will need it," Mordecai said. "Then he will have it." Aurelian said it with the absolute certainty that meant it was already decided and already being arranged. Arrange also to have him invited to the alliance. Formally, on his own merits, not his family name. Genevieve watched this and thought, with a fullness she did not have adequate words for, that this was who he was. The protection he extended was real and unconditional and without calculation. It was the most fundamental thing about him, and it was magnificent. She said none of this out loud. She filed it in the place where she kept things she was certain of. The petition against Velthriss was filed 2 weeks later. The council investigation was swift. The documentation was unambiguous, and the result was a formal sanction against the Velthriss court, the removal of Lord Velthriss from any council advisory positions, and a restitution order that would occupy the Velthriss legal apparatus for at least a decade. Lord Velthriss himself did not attend the ruling. He sent a written acknowledgement through his new primary legal counsel, who was not Sorvain, because Sorvain was no longer acting on his behalf. The threat, which had been the defining feature of Genevieve's life in the estate for months, was over. She found out about the ruling while she was in the laboratory, updating the monitoring data. The improvement in Aurelian's cellular readings over the past month was extraordinary. 38% reduction in degradation activity, the best number she had recorded. She was looking at it on the screen when he came in, and she could tell from the way he moved. Fluid, lighter, with some tension that had been present for weeks now absent. What the news was before he said it. "It's done," he said. "I know." She gestured at the screen. "And look at this." He looked. He was quiet for a moment. 38%, he said. "The numbers correlate very clearly with stress reduction," she said, keeping her voice professional, even though she was also smiling, which aligns with the hypothesis about the underlying cause. The political situation was measurably impacting your cellular health. Now that it has resolved, the body can begin to repair itself, he finished, with assistance. She tapped the monitoring implant data. "The protocol I've developed will help, but the change in your situation is doing at least half the work." He crossed to her, and she turned from the screen, and he took her hands, both of them, fully, warmly, and looked at her with the full unguarded version of his face that she had been seeing more of lately. That version that was not performing composure or managing vulnerability, but was simply present. "You saved my life," he said. "That is not a metaphor." "You kept me safe long enough to do it," she said. "That's also not a metaphor." "No." His hands tightened slightly on hers. "Genevieve, I want to ask you something." "Then ask it." "I want you to stay." He said it simply, the way he said everything that mattered most. "Not for the research, not on contract. I want you to stay because you are, because this is where you belong, with me, in this world." A pause. "I am aware that asking you to remain in the vampire world permanently is asking a great deal. The constraints are real. Sunlight management, blood law protocols, political complexity that will not disappear entirely simply because Velthris has been managed. The world I live in is ancient and complicated and sometimes dangerous." "Sometimes," she said. "Often," he corrected, with that slight, precise quality of honesty. "But it is also, there are things in it that are extraordinary. The history, the continuity, the depth of things that exist here that the human world does not know about. And you," his voice shifted, "you make it better. You make me better. The data on the screen is evidence, but that is not the reason I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment, cataloguing the fullness of his face, the amber of his eyes, the 300 years of architecture that he had been quietly dismantling wall by wall over the course of 8 months with her help, and his own extraordinary, methodical courage. "I already made decisions," she said. "Weeks ago, if I'm honest. I've been updating my remote research affiliation to reflect a permanent base here. Mordecai has been helping with the administrative side." She paused. "I did not tell you because I was waiting to see if you would ask." He stared at her. I wanted to know if you would choose it," she said. "Not assume it, not arrange it without asking. Choose it and ask." Something moved through his face, something vast and warm, and wholly unreserved. "You have been waiting," he said, "specifically to force me to choose the vulnerability of asking." "Treatment protocol," she said. "You've made excellent progress," he laughed. And this time it was not short or surprised. It was real and full, and lit up the laboratory the way the artificial sun lit up the underground garden. And she thought she would remember it for the rest of her life. Whichever version of life she ended up living in this world of ancient halls and amber eyes, and extraordinary danger and extraordinary love. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, and the warmth of him cool-skinned but warm in every way that mattered, settled around her like something that had always been promised. "The implant data," he said against her hair. "I know. I need to update it later, she agreed. Spring came to the underground garden in its engineered, careful way, and Genevieve sat at the iron table beside the reflecting pool, while Aurelian read a document that Mordecai had sent regarding the new alliance protocols that now included, for the first time in recorded blood law history, a formal provision for human medical practitioners with full court access. It had taken Mordecai 3 drafts and considerable legal creativity, but it was done, it was in the charter, it was permanent. Sorvain had come to his first alliance meeting the previous week and had sat quietly in the back and absorbed everything with the focused attention of someone who understood they were being given something valuable. Aurelian had spoken to him afterward for 30 minutes, privately, and Genevieve did not know entirely what was said. But she knew that when Sorvain left, he looked like someone who had been handed a frame for the thing he was becoming, and that Aurelian had watched him go, with the particular expression she recognized as the one that said he was extending protection in a new direction. The monitoring data that morning had shown 44% degradation reduction. In her clinical estimate, continued improvement at this rate would bring the cellular anomaly to a manageable, non-progressive state within 6 months. She had already begun drafting the notes for the follow-up protocol. "You're running projections?" Aurelian said, without looking up from his document. "How do you know?" "You have the expression you get when you are running projections. It is slightly more intense than your reading expression, and less intense than your discovery expression." She had a discovery expression, apparently. "The 6-month projection is optimistic but achievable," she said. "Good." He set down the document and looked at her across the table. The garden light caught his white hair and made it luminous, and the amber of his eyes was warm and steady and fully present. And then the acute phase is managed and we move into long-term maintenance. She paused, which is also interesting. The maintenance protocol will require ongoing data collection and probably some adjustments to your daily patterns. Nothing dramatic, more sleep cycles. Genuinely, your avoidance of dormancy periods is contributing to the stress load. And if you would simply... Genevieve, yes, I was not asking about the protocol. His voice had the quality it got when he was saying something that mattered. I was asking, what comes next for us? She looked at him. The garden was quiet around them, the artificial light filtering through engineered branches, the reflecting pool, perfectly still. Somewhere above them, a city moved through its ordinary morning without any knowledge of this place, this world, these 2 people at this iron table with their extraordinary, improbable, entirely logical love. "I don't know all of it," she said. "The specifics will be complicated, obviously. My family thinks I am working on a long-term research placement, which is technically accurate. The human world and this world overlap more than most people realize, but the management of that overlap takes work. Your political situation will stabilize further, but will never be entirely simple." She paused. "But the broad shape of it, you and I, this place, this work, this life, that part I'm certain of." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you are not frightened by the age difference?" "No. You should perhaps think more carefully about it. I've thought about it extensively. I'm a researcher. I think about everything extensively." She met his eyes. "You are 300 years old, and I am 31. You have seen things I will never see and known losses. I cannot fully imagine. But the person you are now, the person you have become, are becoming the person who sat in a laboratory chair for months and learned to ask for help and learned to name what he felt. That person is entirely present and entirely here. She paused. That is the person I love, not the archive of 3 centuries, not the political legacy, you. Something in his face had gone very still, very full. I have not been known that way before, he said, quietly, simply, as a current thing rather than a historical one. I know. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her warm human hand over his cool, ancient one, and the contact was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. That's one of the things we're building. He turned his hand under hers and held it, firmly, fully, without any of the careful, managed quality that had characterized his early touches, without the diagnostic precision or the controlled reassurance, just holding her hand at an iron table in an underground garden while morning passed overhead. I proposed to one person in 300 years, he said, badly, a century and a half ago. She declined, and she was right to, because I was asking out of political calculation rather than genuine attachment. And we both knew it, and I learned from it. He paused. I am telling you this, because I am going to ask you the same question at some point, and I want you to understand the difference in what it will mean when I do. She looked at him. At some point, she said. When the timing is, when I have found the appropriate. Aurelian, she was smiling. You told Lord Draventis I was your physician before you told me you loved me. You declared our relationship formally to an assembly of 7 vampire courts before you kissed me. Your timing conventions are your own. I have noted this and adjusted accordingly. He looked at her for a long moment, and then the smile came, the full one, the real one, the one she had been keeping since the laboratory. And he stood from his chair and came around the table and took her face in both his hands and kissed her in the underground garden with all the deliberate, certain, irreversible quality of everything he did. And when he pulled back, he said, I would like you to marry me, formally, in whatever form makes sense across both our worlds, with Mordecai spending 3 months creating the legal framework for it, because this will absolutely require a new legal framework. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without any of the intellectual caution that normally preceded her major decisions, because this decision was not new. It had been made in increments over 8 months, in laboratories and council chambers and dangerous corridors and quiet evenings. In every moment he had chosen vulnerability, and every moment she had chosen to stay. He pressed his forehead to hers. His hands were warm on her face, warm from her, she realized, from contact and proximity and the long, slow work of letting himself be held. You realize, she said softly, that this means I will be updating your monitoring protocol indefinitely. I am counting on it, he said, and you will sit in the chair. I will sit in the chair, and occasionally let Thessaly handle things without supplementing her. Occasionally, he said, with the slight, precise quality of someone making a concession they have fully committed to. Within reason, she agreed. Around them, the engineered light shifted to its mid-morning setting, warm and steady, and the reflecting pool held the image of 2 people at a table in a world below the world, a doctor and an ancient guardian, and the extraordinary, improbable, entirely logical life they were building together, in the intersection of his blood law heritage and her clinical certainty, in the space that opened when a vampire who had been programmed to protect and never be protected, finally completely, and with his whole ancient heart allowed himself to be cared for, The monitoring implant continued transmitting. The numbers kept improving. The data was beautiful outside. The city moved through its morning unknowing. Below it, in the deep stillness of a garden that should not have existed, something far more significant than politics or treaties or blood law petitions was taking root. Something that had no precedent in 300 years of careful armored history. Something warm and clear and permanent. Something that felt, against all odds and in defiance of every ancient wall he had built, exactly like home.